It is 4:35 a.m. Tuesday morning. I could not sleep. So I thought, if you can't sleep and you've made breakfast and you've made yourself some coffee and some water, you've tried reading, and I can read, I should rephrase that. I've read and it didn't put me to sleep, and I have no hope of catching a nap before I have to go to work in 2 hours. So I guess I'm just going to do a video. Since there is 37 minutes left in this, 18, I'm just going to go ahead and, instead of 15, I screwed up on the last one. So I'm just going to run, these next ones will be two parts. And back to Andrew Jackson. Let's go.
35, the New York abolitionist Lewis and Arthur Tappan realized powered printing press made something brand new in American politics possible: a mass mailing. And so they sent pamphlets to thousands of influential people in the South, such as ministers, to try and convince them to speak out against slavery. The first batch of pamphlets arrived in Charleston, South Carolina. But the post...
By the way, you know why the first batch went to South Carolina. From the last part, South Carolina was pushing to secede. So the abolitionists who decided to push it went right there. Because I think, my guess, this is just me, they were trying to get something going to where maybe South Carolina would get mad and Andrew Jackson would send in the military. That's just my thinking. Nothing to back that up.
Master never delivered them to the addressees. Instead, they were taken to the town square and burned.
I cut that off. I apologize. They were never delivered. They were captured and burned, and well, you should find out why.
Jackson and the Jacksonians' paranoia about slavery, as is seen in this whole incident about abolitionist literature being sent into the South, like all paranoia, has some foundation in reality. Their fear is that the word would get out to the slave population and would incite slaves to revolt. And this is a concern that they all have in this period, particularly as you get into the early 1830s in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion.
That was another thing, and I completely forgot about that Nat Turner Rebellion, was that by sending it there, yeah, the slaves would go up. There was another, that was their reasoning. My reasoning was that they would offend the white people, the slave owners, and they might rebel, forcing Jackson to bring the hurt down on them. I guess either more their thinking is probably accurate compared to mine, but who knows.
Anytime rebellions have taken place, slaveholders become increasingly paranoid, and the instinct is to squash the articulation of these sorts of expressions as quickly as is possible.
Tampering with the mail was a serious federal crime. But President Jackson tacitly encouraged postmasters to destroy the pamphlets. And he demanded that Congress outlaw mailing them, saying they were incendiary.
The Tappan flyers provide an interesting insight into what we could say is the Jacksonians' view of democracy, because of all things, the ability to petition, the ability to get word out about your position is a fundamental tenet of all democratic societies. So in that sense, then, Jackson and his people are attempting to squash a clear democratic voice in this period.
Remember when I said there were things that Jackson did during his presidency that I did not like? I didn't really care for his presidency. You can't do that. You just can't. Everyone has the right to have an opinion even if you disagree with it. Because the same people who have this opinion also could be people who voted for you. So you are turning people in your base away from you by telling them that they don't have the right to voice an opinion. But they do if that opinion is of you being the president again. What? You can't do that.
Elias Boudinot, the Cherokee Nation. What sort of hope have we from a president who has an inclination to disregard laws and treaties? We have nothing to expect from such a president.
Like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson fervently believed that it was small, self-employed farmers who had made America great. And he believed that the key to keeping it great was to continue expanding west so that each new generation could have farms of their own.
In Jefferson's vision, the frontier was the place that each generation would replicate the ideal Republican community. The problem, of course, is that the native people are already living out there. And with one eye, Americans managed to not notice them. But with the other eye, they couldn't fail to notice them, because as soon as you got there, you were in conflict with them. And that creates the fundamental tension that becomes the story of Indian removal.
In 1830, Jackson won approval from Congress of an Indian Removal Act that appropriated $500,000 so that Native Americans living east of the Mississippi could be removed to land west of the Mississippi. In support of the act, Jackson said,
"What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion?"
But Native American tribes, such as the Cherokee, had an entirely different view than white men of how to relate to the land.
The Cherokee way is to share, is to be harmonious. They really were a spiritual people. They had a way of life that would perhaps put most Christians to shame. They exercised that way of life daily. Every morning, the whole village would go to the water for a blessing. And at this going to water ritual, this old man sung this song. Hi-o wa yakani, hi-te-hu yu yakani, hi-wa aki yakani, hi-wa sa-se yakani, hi-ani ze-si yakani, hi-ani he-ho yakani. So when I sang that song, it would have been the same sound that you would have heard in the 1700s. So that was all disturbed because of the contact with the whites.
Soon after the creation of the United States, many in the Cherokee tribe decided that their one hope of saving their land was to take Thomas Jefferson's advice and embrace the white man's way of life.
The Cherokees, in fact, took exactly the advice that Jefferson offered. They settled down, they put on European clothing, they developed an alphabet, they learned to read and write, they set up town meetings and a mayor and city council and all those things. And they still had to go, because the problem was they were sitting in Georgia. And Georgia was to be ours, not theirs. They could not coexist.
With Georgia preparing to expel the Cherokee, 2 Christian missionaries brought a case to the Supreme Court that challenged Georgia's jurisdiction over the Cherokee Nation. The Supreme Court ruled in the Cherokees' favor, but Andrew Jackson declared,
The decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn.
Jackson encouraged Georgia to ignore the verdict on the grounds that the Cherokee were not really a nation.
And this is another just horrible thing. The Supreme Court at this time, the verdict was handed down by Chief Justice John Marshall, who was tapped to be Chief Justice under outgoing second president John Adams. Side note about John Marshall, he grew up and was basically best friends with future 5th president James Monroe. The name slipped. They had a falling out, but when Monroe became president, they kind of came back together. They parted ways on Monroe sided with James Madison and Thomas Jefferson against George Washington in his first and second term about the way the government should have been run. And if you know anything of my thoughts of Thomas Jefferson, yes, he was instrumental in this country. He was also a bitch, and politely saying it, I really have problems with him. And what is strikingly odd to me is that James Monroe served under Washington and is actually replicated. That's not the word. He's in. So there's a picture, a famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, I think, and he's standing on the boat, and there is a black guy with him, which is Billy Lee, his George Washington's manservant, who was freed upon Washington's death. And there's also James Monroe, who is one of them is depicted holding a flag, which might have been Monroe, and then Billy Lee obviously just stands out because he's black in a white boat, in a white man boat. But John, I don't know where I was going. James Monroe served under Washington, had deep respect for him, and then he just got lured in by Thomas Jefferson. But John Marshall, Chief Justice, and James Monroe both served together at under Washington, and they were at Valley Forge, so they really bonded together. All this to say, in this tirade here, is that Chief Justice John Marshall really did everything he could to follow the letter of the law. I have, by the way, a side note about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. I can get on that tirade another time. But I just wanted to, I just wanted to point this out, that John Marshall really was a good guy. The Cherokee Nation actually in Upper Georgia actually had a system of government that was put in place that was perfectly acceptable up until this point. And so there is a saying that supposedly said that after the ruling came down, Andrew Jackson's job was to protect the Cherokee. And Jackson, he never said this, but supposedly he had said, if Chief Justice John Marshall believes in this, then he should get a military to defend them. But since he couldn't, Jackson encouraged the people of Georgia, kick them out. It's your state, not theirs. And it's just a shitty thing. That was a very long-winded answer, tirade. I'm just going to unpause the video now.
A writer to the Cherokee newspaper The Phoenix remembering that warriors from the Cherokee Nation had played a key role in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend that had launched Jackson on his road to fame, had this request.
Ask of General Jackson when the thunders of his cannon were heard in the southern forest, and he will say, they are a nation. These unfortunate people who flocked to the standard of the brave commander at Horseshoe and nobly fought are now repaid with ingratitude and oppression.
Solely on the basis of the color of their skin, thousands of Cherokee families were evicted from their homes by American soldiers and forced onto what became known as the Trail of Tears. One of the Christian missionaries who traveled with them wrote,
I have no language to express the emotions which rend our hearts to witness this season of cruel oppression. In Georgia, multitudes were not allowed to take anything with them but the clothes they had on. Well-furnished houses were left a prey to plunderers who, like hungry wolves, follow the progress of the captors and rifle the houses and strip the helpless. For what crime, then, was this whole nation doomed to this almost unheard-of suffering?
The period of Indian removal really is a black mark on American history. America, which started out as a shining city on a hill, sinks to the bottom of darkest depths in Indian removal. Andrew Jackson and other Americans were willing to do what it took to separate Indians from their land, if it meant ignoring treaties, if it meant ignoring principles of international law, if it meant ignoring common decency and a sense of justice, then it was done.
I just want to point this out. When Jackson was growing up during the Revolutionary War period, he grew up in a time where in South Carolina, North Carolina, it was Waxhaw, somewhere around there. He grew up in a time when if you ventured too far away, you could be killed by the natives. There was constant clashes. He moved out to Tennessee, where you had to have like military escorts out to Nashville. Raidings happened out there. You could be killed. This is what he deals with up until his 20s. The possibility that you could encounter good natives, you can encounter bad natives, but you could be killed. Now, if you look at the history before this, Americans, pilgrims landing here, friends with some, fighting others, fighting some with the help of other natives. When you look at everything up, and then you have the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War here, what do you have? And I've said this before. You have the French and the natives, Indians, versus the British and the colonists. Fast forward 10 plus years, Americans' Revolutionary War. What do you have? You have the Americans, some natives, and the French later on with, Spanish, Dutch weapons and support, versus the British, some Germans. They weren't Germans. What were they? Hessians. And natives. Then you go to the War of 1812. What do you have? You have the British and the natives against Americans with the help of some natives. So what is a constant thing you have here? You have Americans fighting a foreign country with the help of natives. Some natives helped, but most seemed to fight. Jackson grew up in all this. 3 major wars. French and Indian War he wasn't here for. He wasn't alive. Revolutionary War, War of 1812. his whole life growing up, there was a possible threat. So him doing this is him thinking of his history and how unsafe it was for him. So he wants him out. Had there been this handshake, hug, mingling, intermarriage when the colonists got here, I think it would have been vastly different. But the natives were protecting their land as much as the colonists were trying to defend themselves. So Jackson doing this isn't necessarily doing this because just he's decided we don't want them here. He's also got history, and you have to, regardless of who you are, you will take that into consideration. If you're a woman and you're mugged, or you're with your parents, and your parents, you're a woman with your mother, and your mom gets mugged when you're like 8 years old, that's going to be ingrained in the back of your head that you're probably not safe being a woman at night, being alone. You're always going to think of that. Now, you might take self-defense courses, get a weapon, whatever, but that is always going to be ingrained in you, your safety. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it is what it is when you look at his history of growing up and the fact that this could happen. I'm not saying it was good, much like I give him a pass for being a slave owner because at this time it was acceptable. People appreciated him for doing this. We can look back on it and say, why would you do that? That's terrible. It's just a shitty thing. It was accepted. So I don't frown upon it. I can say clearly, if he was born today, he wouldn't do this. No one would. But you can't make that judgment today and put that on him. You can't put your morals on somebody else who lives in a different time and grew up a different way. Because if I was born in that time period, what's to say I would be any different? What's to say I wouldn't be a slave owner? I know you're not supposed to say that, but how would I know? If I was born into a plantation lifestyle where black people were less than me because that's just how I grew up, why would I be any different? Because I don't have today's morals if I was born back then. So it's just a little tirade here, but you know that I'm saying what he did was garbage by today's standards, but I can't say that it wasn't. It was accepted. It was applauded for what he did back then. So you have to take that also into consideration. You know, it is what it is.
With smallpox and cholera rampant on the Trail of Tears, more than 2,000 Cherokees died. Andrew Jackson had tried to convince Native Americans that he was their great white father. But the Cherokee now had a different name for him.
They call him Jackson. And other Cherokees people hearing me say that would laugh. Jackson, the devil. Jackson, he's devilized.
And I can't say that they're wrong for calling him that back in that day, and even today. Can't say they're wrong, because he did that to them and their family, and you know.
Andrew Jackson. Unless you become more watchful, you will find that the most important powers of government have passed into the hands of the corporations.
That's something Teddy Roosevelt would have said. Oh, wow. Good call. Teddy Roosevelt was the 26th president, by the way. He was number 7. So,
when it came to Indian removal and slavery, President Jackson's views mirrored those of many other Americans. But there was one issue where he was truly a visionary. In his concern for how average Americans would fare as the economy became ever more industrialized.
The world we know was taking shape in those years. And the questions that were so urgent then continue to be urgent. It was the nature of capitalism. It was how people were going to make their livings. And there's nothing scarier, nothing more fundamental to people than how they're going to feed themselves and clothe their families and make their way in the world.
Sure.
For centuries, learning a craft such as shoemaking had enabled workers to make a decent living. But across the country, artisans like shoemakers were suddenly losing their jobs to factories.
All of a sudden, it's a job that can be done by a child, by a woman, by an unskilled man for pennies. But think what happens to the shoemaker. The shoemaker who has spent all of his life learning the skills of making a whole shoe, his skills have become worthless. And as a result, he feels worthless. And if you look at how much money he's got in his pocket, he may be worthless that way also. He's broke.
I guarantee, though, that man makes a better shoe than the child or the woman in the factory. Not saying women can't make shoes, but I'm just saying the factory that's all about pumping out the product as cheap as possible isn't going to take the time to craft the shoe and make it something that would last longer, might feel more comfortable. But in today's world, we don't value that. We value the price.
In the early years of Andrew Jackson's presidency, these working-class Americans created a new way of giving voice to their concerns. The minstrel show. On the surface, it was simply an expression of racism and proof of how little white Americans really knew about black Americans. But the hidden secret of the minstrel show was that it was not just about how whites saw blacks, but also about how they saw themselves.
Of course, you're putting on that mask to make fun of African Americans, but by virtue of putting on that mask, you've also enabled yourself to speak of yourself. The songs of the theater at the time revealed that the audience is feeling squeezed by a new America. It's being squeezed by an America that seems to be coming more and more for the rich instead of the common people. So we can look to the stage and we can find a place in American society where that working class could express in a powerful and gripping way what it felt about what this world was doing to them out there.
For a working-class white American, putting on the mask of a slave was a way of saying, I feel like a slave. The minstrels also talked about the man they hoped would free them. They sang, there's some who at our party rail, call us the ragtag and bobtail. But we have some within our pale, who we are sure will never fail to vote for General Jackson. For Andrew Jackson, the central question of his presidency was what he could do to prevent these average Americans from being exploited by the rich and powerful. The answer Jackson hit upon was to destroy an institution that he thought was giving the wealthy an unfair advantage. Its real title was the Second Bank of the United States. But Jackson's supporters called it the Monster Bank.
Andrew Jackson dislikes all banks, he said at one point, but he particularly disliked the Bank of the United States as established by Congress after the War of 1812. The reason was simple. It had too much power outside of any kind of public accountability. The bank was an enormous economic institution. It could really control credit and therefore control the American economy itself. For Jackson, that meant that the American economy was being run by people who were not elected, that these unelected bankers had their hands on the levers of power and could control people's lives, their destinies, and indeed could control the political system itself.
To Jackson, one of the monster bank's worst sins was that it was funding new-style businesses that were beginning to wrap their tentacles around both the economy and the government. These new businesses were called corporations.
The problem with corporations, as far as Jackson was concerned, was they had no body to be kicked or soul to be damned. They were faceless, anonymous machines that were motivated only by making profit for their shareholders, and as a result they could grow much, much larger than the average consumer, the average worker, the average citizen.
But Jackson's opponents thought corporations would help America become more prosperous, and they thought his plan to blow up the bank verged on insanity, for it was the bank that guaranteed that the paper dollars in Americans' wallets were worth something.
Jackson took a kind of fundamentalist view of money and credit. Gold and silver dollars were real money. Paper was in some sense fake. Those who were perhaps more astute economists than Jackson thought that this position was just short of Neanderthal. The United States had been built on credit. As Henry Clay said in the Senate, we have always been a paper money people. We won the revolution on paper money.
Clay and his allies in Congress decided to put some heat on Old Hickory. Near the end of Jackson's first term, they passed a bill extending the bank's charter. Clay calculated that the president would have no choice but to sign the bill, because a veto would be seen by the American public as so irresponsible it would cost Jackson re-election.
I'm gonna pause it right there on a cliffhanger. And by the way, Henry Clay, boy, he really doesn't know Jackson too well. Especially, Henry Clay could have walked in, could have went to Andrew Jackson's house. The house could have been on fire. Andrew Jackson could have walked in with a pail of water, magic water. He could have just dipped his fingers in there and went, and it put the whole house fire out. And he could have told him, "I'll do this for you." And Jackson would have looked at him and said, "I'd rather my house burn to the ground and kill everyone than to have anything associated with help from you." That's how much he hated him. So Henry Clay, thinking all that, if you're Andrew Jackson, you're going, yeah, watch me veto this. That's how much he hated him. Even if the American people said, you veto this, and we will rush in and take you out of office physically, Jackson would have just put a pistol in his hand and then stamped veto and then said, okay, I'm waiting, with his pistols pointed at the door, ready to just start shooting people as they came through. That was Jackson. So we're going to end it here. It's a cliffhanger. We don't know what he's going to do we? Unless you know history, then you know what's going to happen. So like and subscribe, and until next time, which will be right after this video, I will be doing the final part on the moon.